between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Ares, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. Welcome to Antiquity X. I'm your host, Dr. Judd Burton. And here at Antiquity X, we ask strange questions about our strange past. And the one we're asking this week is, who is this Nimrod? And of course, this is a reference to the biblical Nimrod, which was the topic of the last episode of Antiquity X and our discussion over the debate of whether Nimrod and Santa Claus were the same personality. I think that we covered rather emphatically that they are demonstrably not the same personality. And so we begin today with the figure of Nimrod, and I'll do a sort of character sketch. Now, most of you who are students of the Bible will be abundantly familiar with the character of Nimrod, the personage of Nimrod, and his association with the book of Genesis in particular, and the early Table of Nations and the Tower of Babel. Altogether not a flattering picture of this rather Luciferian individual that the Bible paints. But there are a number of sources, including the Bible and some apocryphal literature, which we'll see will shed some light on the actual identity and potential historicity of the figure of Nimrod. And there's no better place to begin than the passage of Genesis chapter 10, which gives us an account of the descendants of Noah. And starting with verse 6, sons of Ham were Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. Sons of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, Savekta. And the sons of Rama were Sheba and Dedah. Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria to build Nineveh, Rabbah, Calah, and between Nineveh and Calah, that is his principal city. And here you can see a map of ancient Mesopotamia, which was the locale of Nimrod. And Shinar, of course, was the Hebrew designation for Mesopotamia, and would have included the stretch of the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. And referring back to the passage in Genesis chapter 10, there are very recognizable names in these kingdoms. Some of them are Sumerian cities like Erech, which is the Hebrew designation for the city of Uruk, Akkad, of Akkadian fame, and of course Babel. Maybe Babylon, it may be another city. There are a couple of other candidates. Nippur, I believe, is another candidate. But even some of the secondary cities that coincide with the Assyrian period, such as Nineveh and the aforementioned Calah, are recognizable. Now, in Genesis chapter 11, we have the account of the Tower of Babel, and of course you can read that for yourself. The ziggurat depicted here, and I pointed this out before, Babel, or the gate of the gods, is likely some sort of ability or technology that we're not familiar with, that Nimrod and his subordinates used to try and literally assault heaven. And that's certainly implied in the Genesis account, and it's fleshed out in some of the apocryphal stuff like Jasher and Jubilees. This is actually the city of Eridu, And as a footnote to that, Eridu, like a number of early Sumerian cities, was actually built by the Ubaid culture from about the 8th millennium to the 4th millennium BC, and would have been directly in the post-flood timeline. This, of course, is a statue of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is one of the potential aliases of Nimrod. There have been a number of scholars who try to tie Gilgamesh with Nimrod, and there's a good case to be made for that, I think. I deal with that in a chapter of my book, Interview with the Giant. Gilgamesh, of course, is from the famed Epic of Gilgamesh. For the longest time, we thought that Gilgamesh was simply literature, but we know that Gilgamesh shows up as the king of the city-state of Uruk on the Sumerian kings list. It's possible that Gilgamesh is also a family name and may go back even to the Ubaid period, which I think that it probably does. I think Gilgamesh and the early ziggurats were Ubaid. In terms of other aliases for Nimrod, Orion is often associated with Nimrod. Orion was also a mighty hunter and comes from Greek mythology. This is actually an archetype that you find in world mythology. In the Greek context, it's very interesting that he was a giant and worked largely in the service of the god Zeus. Now, there's some other interesting aliases that we'll get into in a moment, such as the personage of Amraphel, which seems to be a later identity of Nimrod. And so here you've got Gilgamesh, you've got Orion. Some people have posited that Osiris or the Egyptian god Sa, who's associated with Orion, may be linked to the identity of Nimrod. If you're a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, you may have read the prequel to The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. And in The Hobbit, there's a huge battle of 5 armies between men, elves, dwarves, the eagles, and a coalition on the other side of orcs and goblins. I think that Tolkien probably took this inspiration from a battle that took place, often referred to as the Battle of Shittim, or the War of the Nine Kings in Genesis chapter 15. And essentially what happens is you've got a fellow from Mesopotamia named Chedorlaomer who leads a coalition of 4 armies, 4 kings, against 5 city-states in the Jordan Plain, including Sodom and Gomorrah. It's this huge epic series of clashes, and one of the individuals is this Amraphel, who scholars had for a long time equated with Hammurabi. That's fallen out of favor after the 19th century. The Midrash, interestingly enough, says that Amraphel went by 3 names: Cush, Nimrod, and Amraphel. Nimrod means rebellion. Amraphel means I declare that I will cast down. So this seems to be a later possible identity or alias for Nimrod, who by some form of demonic influence perhaps was able to live this long extended life, this sort of artificial immortality that he could have potentially learned from earlier ages of giants. And there are some interesting references in Jasher that talk about this, and also in the book of Jubilees, and even in the writings of Josephus. Later writings like the Antiquities talk about Nimrod and undergird those characteristics that he had. But the fate of Nimrod actually fell at the hands of Esau, if we're to believe Jasher chapter 27. Of course, Esau being the brother of Jacob in the line of Abraham. And the passage relates essentially that Nimrod was out hunting, as he was wont to do, and Esau was doing the same. And Esau undoubtedly knew the reputation of Nimrod, and so he hid And at the right moment, he jumped out and killed Nimrod and decapitated him, which also seems to be a recurring dispatchment in the story of giants. And so I'll end this discussion of Nimrod with an article that I read, or news about an article that I read when I was working for the Gowan Research Foundation in Lubbock. I was a young genealogist and historian, and I came in one day and turned the computer on and started reading my news feed, and this story about the discovery of the tomb of Gilgamesh came across the screen, and I thought, that's really interesting. That was March of 2003, and 6 weeks later, the invasion of Iraq began, which I thought was also interesting timing, given the biblical implications of the region and Gilgamesh, and a possible association of Gilgamesh with the identity of Nimrod, who was, after all, the leader of the first New World Order, the first worldwide empire. Fast forward about 2 years, and I began my PhD work at Texas Tech with a historiography seminar. And one of the books that we read had to deal with the importance of material antiquities in the study of history, specifically in this book, Mesopotamian Antiquities. And the book, of course, by that time, it was detailing the destruction of Iraqi Mesopotamian antiquities, and how some of them got onto the black market and some were altogether lost. But what I thought was interesting was a passing, almost parenthetical reference to the U.S. role in the stewardship or protection of these antiquities. And I remember reading about a spec ops team that was given detail at the Baghdad Museum, and they stayed only for 30 minutes to protect those antiquities. I would posit that they knew what they were after and got it. And I would also posit that Nimrod's story is not quite over, which is terrifying. Thank you for tuning in to Antiquity X, and also thank you for your support. Click a like, subscribe, and share if you like the content, and we'll see you in the great beyond. Godspeed.